There's nothing like snook hook sets at dawn or catching a tarpon in the moonlight. Find your next fishing trip made easy on fishingbooker.com and experience the magic of the Sunshine State or any other destination on your fishing bucket list. Book a blue water adventure in search of sailfish or go snapper fishing with the kids. With over 6,000 captains and trips to choose from, planning your next one just got a whole lot easier. Download the Fishing Booker app on the Google Play or App Store, or visit them online at fishingbooker.com to book your trip today. I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, your home for deer hunting news, stories, and strategies. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. I'm your host, Mark Kenyon, and this is episode number 404. And today we're back with our habitat-specific series in which we're getting an expert panel to dive deep into one kind of hunting terrain. And today that's open country. And our panel includes folks such as Andy May, Eddie Claypool, and Jared Scheffler. All right, welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by Onyx. And as I mentioned, we are back with this series that we kicked off last week, in which we are diving into one specific kind of habitat and pulling in a group of people that have some great experience in those types of places and getting different ideas about how to approach it, comparing and contrasting these different perspectives and tactics for hunting the same kind of place, but in wildly different ways. As we did last time, I'm joined by my buddy Andy May, who's a friend and one of the best whitetail bow hunters I know in the world, and he, as well as myself, have been more and more interested in hunting in these kinds of open country habitats, whether that's Nebraska or Kansas, Oklahoma, parts of Iowa, even some open prairie kind of stuff in some of the further east states. You can find pockets like this. But of course, anywhere around the edges of the Great Plains are a perfect example. There's a lot of great whitetail hunting in these types of areas, but it's different than your typical Midwest or Northeast or Southeast hunt where you've got mixtures of timber and fields and crops and whatnot. This is a different world. This is an ocean of grass in some cases where trees might be quite rare, but deer are there. And today we're talking to Eddie Claypool and Jared Scheffler about how to find those deer and how to kill them with a bow. And these two guys have done it consistently and to an impressive degree. They're doing it in wildly different ways. I mean, totally different. You've got Eddie Claypool, who approaches things in a little bit more standard approach with the tree stand and waiting in the right spots, while you have Jared, who is on the ground, chasing them down, getting in close, and getting them killed with a longbow. Both of these guys have been on the podcast in the past, but it was quite a ways back. Back in 2015, maybe? I think you're likely familiar with the two guys, but let me give you a really quick introduction. Eddie Claypool has written for a number of outdoor magazines, including Peterson's Bow Hunting, where he's still writing now today. He's a very experienced deer hunter, as well as a Western big game hunter. He hunts and spends a lot of time in Oklahoma, Kansas, places like that. You should go back and listen to that original episode I had with him back in 2016. It's really great. Gives you a good high-level idea of who Eddie is and what he's all about. Now, Jared is the founder and the host mostly of the Whitetail Adrenaline DVD series, where him and his buddies go out and do some pretty crazy things. They chase these deer on the ground. They use decoys. They sneak up in close. It's just a really interesting way to deer hunt. And as I mentioned already, he's got it nailed. So we're going to explore how these guys go about it. Andy and I are going to chime in with our experiences and our questions. And in short, cool. It's just got me. I just finished with this conversation. We just recorded the conversation, and I'm still kind of riding high. I'm still, for lack of a better term, just jacked up and wanting to drive out to one of these places and try to find a deer in this kind of environment. It's just a really cool thing and something that's worth doing at least once in your life if you haven't already. So without any further ado, let's get into this conversation with Andy, Eddie, and Jared. I know you're going to enjoy it. And even if you don't hunt these kinds of places, I really do think that you can learn something that you'll be able to apply to your own neck of the woods. I'm even going to take some of this stuff and apply it to what I do in Michigan. Even though it's very different, there's some applicable things. And with that, I'm just going to tune this one down and let's get into it. All right. With me on the line, we have got one heck of a trio here to discuss open country hunting. We've got my right-hand man, Andy May, and then our two special guests, Jared Scheffler and Eddie Claypool. Since there's four of us on the line, we're not going to try to do the whole individual introduction. I'll have taken care of that already by now, but suffice to say, thank you all for being here for this. It's going to be really interesting, I think, for the four of us to dive deep into one specific type of habitat. That being this open country. It could be, wide open grasslands in Kansas. It might be scattered timber and fence rows in Oklahoma. It might be what I've seen up in the Badlands of Montana or North Dakota. Me and Andy have hunted some stuff like this in Nebraska. There's a lot of places across the country where you have this relatively open environment. You might even be able to take some of the things we're going to talk about today and apply it to northern Ohio, where it's just wide open ag fields with very little traditional timber cover. That all said, there's a lot of different ways to approach deer hunting in places where you don't have your traditional big timber, broken country, et cetera, et cetera. And that all brings me to you, Andy, who I know the two of us have shared, we've shared one hunt in this type of country. I know it's something you are more and more interested in. Every year we talk and you're like, yeah, I got to get back out there. I got to go out to Wyoming or Nebraska, these different places, because there's something special about hunting these locations, or those big skies, those wide open vistas. And I know this is something you're curious about. You want to scratch that itch more, just like last week's conversation with hill country. So I'm gonna kick it to you again, because you seem to be a better host than I am sometimes. Where do you want to start this conversation with Eddie and Jared?
Well, man, first I just want to say how excited I am to have these two particular guys for two different reasons. Eddie, I've been reading Eddie's articles for a long time. I've admired him, his longevity in bow hunting and his consistent success. I just think it's so cool, and just a vastly different style, I think, than Jared. And on the other hand, with Jared, it's just like we've been able to actually watch this guy on videos do things that I'm not sure how many more bow hunters could actually pull off some of the stuff he does. So it's just really cool to have these two guys on. I'm super pumped about it. And yeah, I love the open country. I just don't get to hunt it as much as I think our two guests have. But I try to make it a point to get out there now every year, at least for a couple days. But I think let's just start the conversation with just the basics. Like what are you guys looking for? If I was a new guy and I'm going to head out west, to Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, what is it you're looking for in a piece of ground that we would consider open country? Is there something you're looking for on the map that sticks out, or are you just kind of going there and hitting it, as soon as your feet hit the ground, you're not even familiar with the area? I'm just kind of curious how you guys both approach that. So why don't we start with Eddie?
Okay, well, it goes without saying the first thing I'm looking for, of course, is access, and often that means public land. Not all of the states qualify there, like Oklahoma. You can get out in western Oklahoma and have a lot of open public land access, but Kansas is, a little thinner on it. Nebraska's got tons of it, and et cetera, on up into the Dakotas and stuff. But access is my first priority. I don't worry about looking at the habitat. I don't care. It doesn't take a brainchild or a rocket scientist to figure out what you're going to do with it. If you're a decent bow hunter, it may intimidate you at first, but you got to realize that open country, whitetails love it. I've hunted the prairie of Kansas ever since the first year Kansas even opened up to non-residents. And I've taken a lot of bucks out of places that nobody hardly ever even looks at when they're driving by. I mean, there might be 3 cottonwoods in a square mile. So don't overlook the open spaces. The deer numbers are there. They're not as high as they are back in the traditional farm, woodlot country. But, if you're after a lot of, quality time, that's the reason I go. I like the wide open spaces and the quiet and the no people. That's ingredients of a good hunt for me. So I don't look for any specific habitat type. I think I could jump into any of it, whether it be high plains or prairie or, desert even. I hunt the coos deer, the whitetails, the little whitetails in open country. So my main goal is to find access where I can get it. And if not public, then you better go early. You better start working. You better start calling, and you better start researching to get your public land access. There's a lot of people that will let you hunt, in the Midwestern central states where the plains are. But, it takes time to make sure you get on somebody and procure a relationship. So anyway, that's my main goal, is to just make sure that I'm going to, have a place to hunt when I get there. And if it's a state that's got a lot of public, it's a non-issue. If it's not, I research the public that is available. And if not, I go take a vacation in the summer or come through there sometime and spend maybe even a week knocking on doors. You've got to, as a blue-collar do-it-yourselfer, you got to work hard on access one way or the other.
Quick follow-up before we jump to Jared. When you're not as worried about property habitat, it sounds like. So what I'm wondering then,
right.
So that's beforehand, but when you show up to a piece, I'm curious, how do you determine if it's, how do you determine the quality? What's your first quality check on a piece of property? Is it a quick walk? I'm just wondering, because it seems like open country, the sign that's available, where you can find sign, all that seems a lot different to judge than traditional farm country, where I can walk a property in 5 minutes. I'll find the big rubs or the scrapes or the highways of trails, and I can tell you, oh yeah, there's a bunch of deer here. It seems a little bit different in open country. So how do you judge, is it worth spending time on this property or not?
Well, I have a lot of time that most people don't, so I can go to a lot of these places, and I spend a lot of time in the spring when I'm turkey hunting. I go to these places. I beat them down in the spring. I look for sheds. I look for all the old sign is right there in front of you during the spring when you're turkey hunting. So anyway, it's hard to say other than going and putting your foot on it, and you may have to, instead of walking a woodlot in Illinois, you may be walking a 10-hour day. I mean, I've literally put in 10-hour days, walked 15, 18 miles in that country. And, if you're looking for a really big buck, you're going to have to look for the big sign, either I call it a 4-finger track type scenario where you got big mature animals, or the big rubs. And it can be deceiving, because a lot of places I go, like in Nebraska and stuff, I can see some rubs that will pop your eyes out, and come to find out those deer that are doing that a lot of times aren't necessarily really large antlered deer. They're big mature bucks. It could be 6, 7, 8-year-old bucks. They're bruisers. But a lot of times the genetics ain't there in certain places. I hunt in Nebraska. I don't hunt, where they have the better quality deer in Nebraska. The most deer I hunt that may die of old age with 130 or 40-inch rack on them. And so you just throw up some cameras. If you're in the fall, get out there and throw some cameras up in the stringer cover. There's always, if you're a deer hunter, you can look on Google Earth, and even if it's 10 miles of open country, there's going to be some stringer cover somewhere of some type, along a creek, fence lines. Get some cameras up and let them tell you what quality of deer you're messing with.
Yeah, I love that. I love that answer, Eddie, because it's tried and true. Working hard, doing your pre-scouting, and finding those areas. And what I love about this question is that I think Jared's answer is going to be different in a lot of ways. So I'm really curious, Jared, how would you answer that same question?
Well, I think one thing that Eddie brought up is he doesn't really zone in on one particular type of habitat. And right away, I reflected on that. That's one thing that I don't either. I focus on trying to actually get a visual on a big buck. So if I haven't hunted an area, or if I haven't been there in a year, which is usually the case, I'll start out that first day putting the miles on the vehicle, driving by a lot of different public land, and I'll get a pretty good idea by the time that day is done of where other hunters are hunting and just a general feel of what's going on. And usually that's one thing I'm very blessed with, is a good set of eyes. And so I spend a lot of time glassing. Some pieces I'm glassing 2-3 miles out sometimes. And this year especially, I noticed it seems like the pressure level on public has been going up quite a bit over the last 3 years versus the way it's been the last, say, 10 years ago or 5 years ago even. And so that's a whole nother game in and of itself. Is like, I'm usually trying to, keep a low key on pieces that I'm hunting. So I'm setting up on some of these pieces 2 miles out, sometimes just so other hunters don't see what I'm up to. And the point that Eddie brought up about the habitat, yeah, I don't look at aerials or do any of that prior to my hunt. I get to an area or a pocket, and then I just start putting the miles on the vehicle, driving by a lot of different public. And you don't always get a visual. We were on a hunt this past fall. It was a new pocket, new area. I noticed where there was a lot of different hunters hunting, and there was a big piece of public, about a square mile, I guess, and it looks like cropland. It literally looked like cropland. We didn't leave. It's the back half of it. It was, open country, no brush or anything like that. But the back half of it, you couldn't see from any road. There was 2 miles beyond that of private ground, so you couldn't glass it from anywhere. And it was getting down to one of our last days. We only had a few days, and it was about 11:30 before we walked in there. And once you know it, that's where all the big mature deer were hanging out. We got onto a big drop tine and should have got that deer, but just things didn't quite come together. And we ended up extending the hunt. We were going to leave that day, and the next morning, here was a mega 8 on there, a different one. And that's a piece that all these other bow hunters, I was watching them. They were hunting the creek bottoms, and it seems like on public land, that stuff that really pops out in an aerial, that stuff seems to be what a lot of other hunters target. So I find a lot of times the mature, older class public land bucks, aren't usually in that stuff. Usually I'm finding them in the stuff, just like Eddie kind of said, he mentioned you might have 3 trees out there and it might not look like much, the little tiny, spots that other hunters are overlooking. At least if we're talking public land, open country, that's land anybody else can hunt. And so that's kind of my general, I guess, how I go about it is I get to an area and I just start putting the miles on, and I get a pretty good idea where other hunters are, get a feel for things. Hopefully I get a visual on a big buck. And once I have that visual, I make a play and put together a game plan from there.
So Jared, if you don't say you're going on, I don't know, it's a bad year or whatever, you 2 days in and you don't got a visual on something that piques your interest. I've watched, many of your videos. I've seen how you will get out of the car and kind of move around in glass. Is that pretty much like you described this past hunt? Is that kind of what you're doing? You'll just kind of pick spots way off the road and you'll hike in and give them a try. And if there's deer in there, you're in the money. And if not, you're hiking back out and doing the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. If there's a pocket that you just get a feeling about that you can't, like in a lot of that open country, I do find a spot where I can get on a high point from the vehicle and long range glass it. And if I don't see anything visually, I'll just move on to the next piece. But there are pieces that you just, in your gut, you just feel like, I haven't seen anybody else hunting there. It looks like crap. There might be a little tiny ditch that you see on your aerial once you're there, and it's like things just kind of click. And unfortunately, one of my favorite pieces in Kansas that I discovered a few years ago, that was a piece where you have to walk back into it. But unfortunately, there was another fellow hunter from Wisconsin in there for 10 days straight, and I never got a chance. I didn't want to mess up his hunt, and so I didn't go in there. It was about a square mile piece, but it's open country, so it's like, one of them deals where a square mile that's not a lot of ground in the open country. And so I never actually got to go in there, but that's a piece where I did discover a spot about 3.5 miles out that I found that I never looked at before, where I was able to glass more than I could ever before. So I start looking for pieces this year. I really noticed how I was looking 2-3 miles out. Sometimes it was just so other hunters wouldn't see what I'm up to. And because that turns into a whole nother game, I guess.
You bring up a good question or a good point. The fact that in open country, it just seems like, a square mile of open country is very different than a square mile of thick timber and mixed fields and ag and all that kind of stuff. So how do you, and maybe I'll throw this to you, Eddie, first. Eddie, how do you look at hunting pressure on open country differently than you might in Illinois or Iowa in traditional ag land? Do you have to react to it more or differently, or do you think that deer give you a break in some kind of fashion? How do you think about that?
Well, I think you have to deal with it very differently than in traditional country, because you're not talking woodlot whitetails here that'll go over on the next 40 over and wait you out and be right back. A lot of open country deer, they are very vagrant, especially the bigger mature bucks, and especially during the rut. I don't know how to put into words what I do. I really don't. Other than, I've spent the largest portion of my hunting career before bow hunting got high tech, before trail cameras, before GPS, before Google Earth, before anything. I had to just, go out and spend an absolutely enormous amount of time in the field. You get a feel for what you're doing. I don't know if that's a good way to put it, but you just gain savvy. You get to where you can look at country and you can make judgments on it that other people aren't making. And I know that's not going to help anybody with their own personal strategy. Everybody's looking for shortcuts nowadays. They want you to tell them the secret formula. There may be one, but I don't know it. Maybe the younger guys nowadays have figured it out and can put it into a formula. My formula was just time and savvy. And on open country deer, I have went out in places that literally I would hunt for the entire on and off for the entire month, October, November, and even into December, and never see another human being. Nobody in their right mind would even hunt out there. Be a mile, 2 miles maybe in any direction to the nearest pocket of whitetail cover. But I have patience of Job. I know what goes on out there in the rut, and I will set a fence line, maybe a cottonwood tree. If I can see for 300 or 400 yards in every direction, I'm going to call one in if I have to. All I need to do is get my eye on a big rutting buck crossing the open country somewhere during the rut, and I feel like I'm going to call them in and kill them. I don't hunt the hubs where everybody hunts. You mentioned a while ago, find out where everybody hunts. Well, they're all going to hunt where all the deer sign is and where all the deer are. I hunt exactly away from all that for a lot of reasons. I'm not going to mess with the people. I'm just not, I'm antisocial to begin with. But anyway, I'm going to get out there and catch that buck when he travels from this creek bottom here 3 miles over to the other one. If he'll be walking down a fence line, a hedgerow, a brushy finger draw or something. And, I set sometimes for days on end and don't hardly see a deer to speak of. But when I do, it's usually a really good, mature deer, because I mainly employ this strategy during the peak of the rut during November. I've jumped these deer living out there in October many, many times on my scouting trips. I've jumped them out in the grass, the prairie of Kansas, where literally they were bedding out there all day long in blue stem prairie grass, and the nearest tree would be over an air mile for 360 degrees in every direction. People don't even believe those deer live out there, but the big ones specialize on it. They live with their eyes. They can see. They bed on them prairie knolls. They can see for half a mile in every direction. They're like antelope almost. And so you just got to get savvy and convince yourself what's possible out in that open country. Because if you don't have it in your head to begin with, what's out there and what you can do with it, you won't go out there.
Hey, Eddie, so that's a really cool description of kind of the areas like you tend to pick out.
Right.
Would you mentioned like a cottonwood tree? And one of my questions that I had written down was like what I call like landmark trees. I've heard the guys that hunt open country mention landmark trees that are kind of just out in the open, one single tree or a little stand of cottonwoods or something. Is that the kind of stuff you're looking for? Or are you actually going out there and finding like maybe something like a primary scrape or something under that's worked and you're expecting a lot of deer to come from? Or is there really something to like these landmark trees where deer kind of come and go to and from them?
I think there is a lot to that. Deer are like a dog, I believe. They've got scent posts. That's what a lot, in my opinion, as a signpost rub is. It's more of a scent marker than anything. It's like a dog that'll walk around his territory, maybe, there's a city block he lives in, and he'll pee on each fire hydrant on each corner of that block. Well, deer, I think, socialize a lot by smell. And, these trees like this, I don't hunt them because they're maybe, say, what they call a landmark type tree that every deer is going to come to. I mean, if I find a giant signpost rub out in the prairie, which I have done, let me tell you real quickly about a buck I killed up in the prairie of Kansas a few years ago. Square mile of blue stem. It had one little, I call it a swag. It was a gentle ravine that wound through it. And in the entire length of that mile through that little swag, there might have been a half dozen cottonwood trees scattered about every 200 to 300 yards up and down it. No brush cover, just grass, a few scattered cottonwoods. I went out there and one day, walked that ravine, and there was a little sumac tree there, and it had a little rub. I walked over to it, and right there beside it was a cottonwood about 4-inch in diameter that had been growing up by it, and it had a big old rub on it. Well, I said, okay, case closed. There's one right here close. Probably I've already run them off. And all I got to do is get back here, get in one of these trees here close where I can see this entire area right here. And he's going to show up during the rut. I'll see him somewhere. So I sat there 2 complete days from dark morning till dark evening. Didn't see a close deer, anything of any size. I think I only saw like 2 total deer on the earth in those 2 days, and they weren't close and they weren't big. On the 3rd day, right at dusk, I looked out there, and this buck was standing on the knoll out there 300 yards in the prairie grass, just standing out there looking around. I clicked my antlers a couple of times and seen him look my direction, and he dropped off into the ravine up above me, maybe 300 yards. And I thought, man, this could be good. Stood there at full alert for about 10 minutes, and the next thing I know, I catch a slight movement. The blue stem prairie grass was literally close to 4 foot tall. And I looked to my right as far as I could, and he was standing there at 35 yards, just like a statue looking around. He had eased up that ravine, took him about 10 or 15 minutes to get there. And he was on full alert looking for what he'd heard, and it was one of them nip and tuck deals to get that deer bow shot, because it was dead calm that day. You could hear a pin drop out of the tree. But to make a long story short, he ended up getting himself bow killed right at dark, had maybe 15 minutes of shooting light left, and he had been bedded out there in that prairie grass and got up late in the evening. And he was so old, he didn't hardly have a tooth in his head. He was one of these old ancient bucks that was just a prairie monarch that had lived out there all his life and survived with his eyes. And for me to accomplish killing him out there in that type of a habitat with my bow, those things rank right up there on the top of the totem pole with you all your days. You're just really satisfied to pull it off. But anyway, that's kind of the way it works with me. I believe they come to those certain trees as a landmark sometimes, but especially if you got any overhanging limbs, like you mentioned, where you can find a scrape. If you ever find a scrape out in the open prairie, it ain't there for no reason, and there will be a dominant buck. Right? Because if you take the prairie grass I hunt in up in the Flint Hills of Kansas, every square mile up there has got a large antlered dominant buck in it, and he may live out in that grass, but his sign is there somewhere. So if you get out there and look for it and find just a little bit of the sign, to me, if you put that with the patience of Job, then you ought to have a chance at that deer probably.
Eddie, do you think you mentioned calling a few times? It sounds like that's been a big part of your success, or a tactic you often use. Do you think because you pick these spots that are away from like the obvious where all the other hunters are, the creek bottoms that are, have more trees and stuff, that you're kind of out in these spots where typically they don't ever encounter other humans? Do you think that is part of the reason your calling is so effective?
Oh, it's absolutely. I mean, I've always said this right here, redneck, but it's simple and it's the point. I'm a great hunter of dumb deer. I mean, you give me dumb deer, I'm pretty good. You put me in the Northeast with the most educated whitetails in the world, I may become a very average bow hunter, but I love to hunt dumb animals. So I go to the extremes of getting dumb animals in front of me. And yes, out in that prairie like that, those big mature bucks, if you really know their lifestyle, if you can really grasp it, they don't come down to the standard cover hardly ever. They don't live down there with the rest of the deer. They're vagrants, they're loners, and they don't get bothered. They don't get educated a lot. So when you get out there, and you're sitting there like a diamond in a goat's rear end, with your bow, and one of them comes by, then, you're dealing with a dumber deer. In a way, it's not a dumber deer because it's usually, if it's an older mature buck, it's still got the goods. But you catch them with their pants down. The deer that are down there in those creek bottoms, those 2, 3, 4-year-olds that are getting messed with all the time. I mean, it's just like anything else in life. Give me dumb elk, I can kill them. Give me dumb whitetails, I can kill them. You got everybody else can cut their teeth on the ones that's getting hammered all day long. I won't be there for a lot of reasons. I don't want to hunt super educated deer. The ones I'm after ain't going to be a number down there because they get killed. And I don't deal with people too well.
Jared,
sorry.
I think Eddie hit one nail on the head there too when he said that I can definitely attest to, and that is those big mature deer like that, they don't go down in there. That's pretty rare. Maybe a fluke hot doe will drag one down there once in a while or something, but. It's like that piece that I was talking about that me and Matt walked into where these mature bucks were back in there. I mean, that was a mile from prime, lush creek bottom, the kind of stuff that most whitetail hunters would be drooling over. And I never stepped foot in there because those big deer, I never seen them hardly even get to where you could see them, like they knew where they were at. And the reason I kind of hit on that piece is because I went back late season. I had to cut that trip short. Went back late season, and in that square, it was a big square with no road going through it. Most of it was private, but with this public, I ended up seeing, I don't know, probably 6 more bucks that I figured were 5 to 6 year plus old animals. In the course of, I don't know how many days I was there in late season. The one day I had 12 bucks together batchered up, which was kind of a crummy deal if you're trying to late season bow hunt and play the ground game with them like me. That's pretty tough when you got 12 sets of eyes and it ain't rut,
Yeah.
Jared, what about the landmark tree thing that Andy brought up? Now I know most of the time you're on the move, you're trying to get eyes on a deer, but do you ever find yourself in a situation where you haven't found one, but you come across a piece of sign like a lone tree with a big scrape underneath it or a huge rub? Do you ever take a second and say, you know what, this is the spot that might be worth waiting as a scouting point or anything like that? Do you put any value into something along those lines?
There's been many times over the years since we quit running tree stands back in 2009 that I said, Boy, if I hunted with a tree stand, that would be a hell of a spot. And I do think that a person that has a balance of both, I just love hunting whitetails on the ground, and I'm too impatient to wait a real long time. But there's been many times where, I know that I'd be better off sometimes, having that as a strategy. It's just like Eddie brought up calling. That's a tool that you can use, and sometimes that works. And it's like, that's the way I kind of look at things. Like, we have that decoy. That's a tool. It's not for every situation, but for the right situation, we'll break that out. Or Chansey, he's great at calling, and sometimes you break that out. You got all these different, things in your arsenal, your hunter's toolkit, whatever you want to call it, that it's like, different strategies apply and to certain scenarios. And I think, if I had more patience, then there's been many times that I've come across situations just like Eddie described there, that it's like, yeah, if I put my time in there for 5 days, I'd probably kill a big one. And then sometimes we get the visual and catch one walking by, or he wasn't bedding too far away from there. That we see that quite often.
Yeah. Let's dive into something that both of you mentioned, but I'd like to get in a little more detail. It's the whole calling thing, which it sounds like, at least in your perspective, Eddie, seems to work better in these areas than others. Maybe because these deer aren't pressured as much as maybe they are here in me and Andy's home state of Michigan. Can you walk through in detail the types of calls you think work best in open country, or the scenarios when you would use some kind of call in this kind of country? Maybe Jared, you can kick us off with just kind of a rundown of the details behind how and when you might call in these places.
A lot of people know my kind of ground game strategy. So, I generally, because I'm going to try to put together a game plan to go to this deer, I generally hold off on calling myself unless he's covering too much ground and I can't get ahead of him, or I don't have him bedded, or sometimes there's one across the line, or he gets over across the line onto private. That's another scenario I'll pull calling out. But other than that, my strategy is usually like, I like to lay quiet, not let him know, bed him, or maybe I've already got him bedded, and then I'm going to plan a route in like that. The one thing about calling in open country too, Eddie brought it up. It is very effective, and it's really effective when you got a decoy on top of it. A lot of those open country areas, they, not always, but like the plains of Kansas, the deer populations generally aren't too high. So I think that helps make the calling, better. And maybe Eddie can hit on that a little bit more.
Yeah. What would you say, Eddie?
Yeah. Well, definitely the population is, low in the prairie type country, but so is the people population, which makes it a go for me, because, to me, as I've gotten older, and don't get me wrong, I've lived through most of the stages of bow hunting maturity, and I don't knock anybody for whatever stage they're in, but you'll learn, if you get to be blessed to live long enough and do it long enough, you'll eventually get to be where it's about a lot more than just killing those giant antlers. I've chased them giant antlers for 40 years, and I've got my share of them. Now it's more about, the quality of the outing, wide open spaces and quiet, unplugging from the rat race. So, yeah, that's why I hunt the prairie. And as far as the calling goes, here's the deal with me. I've always admired a guy that can get on the ground and go after these things. I can't be a specialist, in that, because I set a tree. I have not felt like I am good at getting on the ground and killing whitetail. So I totally admire the ability to do that. I'm envious of it, even though I'm accomplished at what I do. I'm not accomplished at what you're doing. You know what I mean? And so you need to know that I totally am awed by the fact that you pursue these big bucks on the ground and kill them effectively with a bow. I sat somewhere, so the calling's a lot more effective for me. I can totally see why you wouldn't want to call on the ground. It's going to focus that deer on you. To me, it'd be a buddy system. If I was going to be on the ground and call, I would want somebody with a decoy off to the side of me calling, and then maybe have me be the shooter. I don't know. I'm speculating. But for me, sitting in a tree, it's deadly, because I'm trying to bring a deer to me that is not going to be able to see me when he gets there. And yeah, the decoy thing can be really good. If I have one, I've had them react to it every type of direction, good, negative, whatever. I've just about got to where I don't use the decoy calling anymore because if I see a rutting buck that I call prowling, in other words, he's crossing country and he's just stumbling along looking to get somewhere to go harass another doe, I just feel like I can call the thing in almost all the time. And I do it mainly with a grunt call. I just standard O. I don't get fancy. Couple of grunts. If he's so far away that he's not going to hear it, I always carry a large set of antlers to get their attention because I've actually stopped them from probably a third of a mile or so off in the prairie with a big set of antlers just to get them stopped and get them to listen and then give them a couple of loud grunts. And then I've watched him walk a third of a mile unbroken to walk right up 10 yards from my tree and stop. And so grunt call is deadly. I don't ever call unless I'm absolutely have to. In other words, I'll call to get his attention and get him started. I don't make another sound unless he loses interest. Don't overcall. Mm-hmm. They'll get far more suspicious of overcalling than they will undercalling. Keep their curiosity up. Don't let them pinpoint you any more than necessary. If they're coming from a long distance, they're not going to know within, X amount of feet where you're at over there. So let them get over there and then give them a chance to walk around you a little bit, trying to see, where you're at and give you a good shot. If you're calling when they're walking in, they're going to have you pinpointed and they're going to walk right up there and stand there facing you, looking. And, so anyway, grunt call and have a big set of antlers to catch one's attention from way off.
What about wind direction? In broken country and ag land here, a lot of times we're not going to see deer as far away as you might. But one of the things I'm thinking about is this deer generally on my downwind side? If that's the case, I probably won't call to him. Even if I'd love for him to come in closer, I'd be worried about him swinging downwind all the way and catching my wind as he comes in. Do you worry about that same thing? Because it seems like an open country where there's maybe no obstacles. It's really easy for them to swing downwind. Do you see them do that? What are your considerations there?
They do sometimes. I've had them, especially if it's. I like to kill these suckers during the absolute peak rut when they're literally just staggering around in a stupor, and I'm talking like usually from about the 12th, 15th of November on. The breeding is starting. They're kind of getting goofy. The big ones finally show up. The really big ones that you don't even know exist will show up by around, sometimes I have bucks out in that prairie that will show up around the week of Thanksgiving that I don't even know existed. They're coming from somewhere, and they're usually the absolute biggest. You'll see them one time. You had better get them killed that time. You're never going to see them again. They're liable to be 5 or 8 miles from there the next day. I don't know where they go. They're like vapors, but they will at times, if it's earlier in the rut, especially in October, you might start trying to call to one. He might start coming, but he's really more alert. He's really more thinking, and he will swing around and get you. And so I just look at the deer and the time of year and what he's doing and how goofy I think he is. And, if he's goofy out of his mind with the rut, usually at first call, they just beeline it right to you. They just beeline it.
Eddie, is there a certain grunt call that you have has become your favorite, or are you just kind of whatever you can get at the store?
Well, I'm a simpleton. I really am. I actually never even bought a grunt call for I first got one about 10 years ago. Now that tells you a lot. I used to just use my voice, literally. I could sound just like a buck grunt with my voice, and I just did it with my voice. I finally ended up getting, I think it was a Primos hardwood or something. Just something, I know what they sound like, and anything that'll make that sound blows my skirt up. So no, I don't have a favorite call or anything. Yep.
Where do you want to go next, Andy?
Well, so Jared, you guys both could probably answer this, but I think I've seen it on some of your videos, Jared, but are you seeing sometimes like individual mature bucks kind of in the same general area of open country year after year? Like they're like they obviously mature bucks have a home range. It varies depending on, terrain and habitat. But it seems like in open country, you sometimes get on those same bucks in very similar areas, right?
Yeah, but Eddie brought up a good point there about, sometimes they might be coming from 5-8 miles away, and he said, you better get them killed that day when you see them. That just made me think about, over the last few years, I've had 3 different big bucks that by the next day, I had a straight line distance on them of over 4 miles that they had went. Mm-hmm. It's crazy. And for sure, 100% the same deer, so I was just kind of thinking about this about a month ago when we had one that was just over 4.5 miles. That's straight line. That's no fooling around. That's right to a T. I had a marked spot that you could see on the aerial and all that. But it got me thinking about like the range. So if I got a big buck spotted one day and I don't get him killed in that open country, I know that they can be that far away. But that makes it pretty challenging for like myself to I got my hands full trying to find him a lot of times the next day, because he could be anywhere, let's just say 4 miles from that spot. So now you're talking about an area that you got to cover that's 8 miles by 8 miles. Most of it's probably going to be private, and you're going to hope maybe you got a couple pieces of public, 3, 4, maybe in that 8 mile by 8 mile section. You're talking about 40,000 acres that he could potentially be on. That's the kind of range that some of those those open deer cover. But as far as year to year, I don't actually see generally the same buck. Like, I go out there, I'll find new bucks every year and wonder what happened to this one the year before. So I don't know. I haven't had much success on that, but for people that know my style, I don't do any pre-scouting. I don't run cameras. I spend very little time in an area if I don't get a visual, and I'm pulling the plug and moving on. And I try not to get attached to a deer. I love big bucks just the same as all of us on here do, but I try not to do that because it's easy to get hung up on them, and they might be on private. And I had that happen to me 2 years ago. A big massive deer that I thought would end up on public. I kind of let some opportunities go on some good, beautiful public land deer that I shouldn't have, but so.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I hunt a lot of, it's a little different. I hunt a lot of Northwest Ohio in a couple counties where it's 99% open, flat ground, but it's ag. So, once the corn and the beans come out, it's just flat marble, like flat top, open country. And the deer do have they are very nomadic, I have noticed. But what I did start to key in on is I was starting to find out that certain mature bucks were showing up. Say I often found bucks that would be 2-3 miles apart at various parts of the season, but then they would show up in specific little areas of cover during the same time of year. And it wasn't like a guaranteed thing, or every deer was doing that, but I was starting to see trends where I was kind of picking up the same deer in the same small pockets of cover, very similar times year to year. So I was just curious if you ever saw that out there.
Yeah, I think that generally, I think that if I found a big buck in that open country and I had my heart set on him and I didn't get him one year, I do think if I dedicated myself to that area and didn't move on, if I didn't find him, eventually I'd probably find him if he wasn't dead. He would probably be somewhere, my buddy Tanner there, he shot one that he should have gotten last year, and that it took him 4 or 5 days to find him, and that deer was 6 miles away from where he was on him the year before.
Wow.
And he did end up getting him, and that was a big one. But But yeah, I mean, I don't think they're going to be 50 miles away or 25 miles away. I think you have a rare case of that happening, but yeah, they cover ground in that open country.
What about you, Eddie?
It's been my findings that once they get, I don't know, let's just say they get above 4.5 years, somewhere in there where the breaking point is, where they become fairly much of a loner. Out in that open country, they will, I don't know at that point when they finally kind of decide to become the vapor type buck, if they're going to stay around where they were born and raised, or if they're going to leave country and go make their way in another spot. But when they get to where they're going and they finally start into the older part of their life from, let's just say 4.5 on up, they develop a very finely tuned plan on where they can live and not be bothered. And they figure it out real quick, and it doesn't necessarily conform to what we, the people, would think of maybe, but it works for them. And I think they pretty well stay in a small area most of the year out in that open country. I think, once they get done rutting, they go to their hidey hole, I call it, area, and it may not be a hole. It might be right out in the wide open grass. It could be a big old prairie basin. I've seen them bed in a basin that was a 1/2 mile wide in all directions, that only had a couple of little spots of waist-high buckbrush out in it, and for some reason, that's where they liked. And I think they live in those spots until the rut. Then they get up and they start to travel, and they don't go very far, I don't think, until they start, once they start breeding, they finally lose their cookies. They get goofy. That's the time of year when you're liable to see one of them walking across the interstate or standing in the front of your truck in the county road. They get out of their mind around Thanksgiving. They've been breeding. All of a sudden, they can't find another hot doe hardly, and they lose their cookies looking for that last little flurry of rut that last hot doe they can find. And they're liable to travel literally countless miles during that time of season. But as soon as that starts to get over there in December, they'll migrate right back to their hidey hole, I do believe, because they make a living getting to 7 or 8 years of age by staying in a hidey hole somewhere. They don't get that old by walking around in different places all the time. They'll get their rear ends poached or shot off by some ranch hand. Something will happen to them. They have a hidey hole area out in that open country that makes them a living.
So you mentioned right there, some of that, some kind of little brush that might be a hidey hole for a buck out there. And earlier you mentioned a handful of other kind of habitat features that might attract deer movement a little bit. You mentioned that swag, like a kind of a low ravine. Mm-hmm. You mentioned fence rows. You mentioned, some of these isolated patches of trees. For someone new to this type of hunting who's considering going out to open country for the first time, are there any other habitat features to consider? I'm just thinking, as a new guy, if I came out there and I had a list of like 10 different things I should be looking for, one of them is going to be a swag, a low ditch to through there. One of them is going to be some tree lines. Are there any other cover or terrain features that someone should put on their list of check on this or consider watching for deer in this type of zone?
Well, when you asked that, one little thing popped into my mind. Now, this isn't real common, but it occurs, and I've found them, especially up in Nebraska a lot. I call them, they're not potholes, but they're close, little swampy spots that are low-lying, and they're out in the middle of nowhere in open country. Maybe they have cattails, or maybe they don't, but they stay wet way more than anywhere else. They'll grow some stuff that's a little bigger and taller. And I'm telling you, I just personally believe that's where a lot of these bucks make their living, in those little spots like that. They've got, usually a little bit of water there. And, I have watched mature bucks pre-rut out in the prairie, a mile from any trees in any direction, get up 30 minutes before dark, start browsing in the prairie grass, in the grass. Now, there's like 17, or I don't remember, I read it somewhere, there's like, I don't know how many kinds of species of things that grow out in that grass that are all high priority to a deer. People look at that grass and they say, well, that's just cattle land. Them deer can't make a living out there. Don't even kid yourself. They can make an awesome living out in that grass. There's all kinds of things they eat out there, and it's all down at the ground level. Because I've watched them put their head down in that blue stem and browse down on the ground level for a minute or two at a time before they ever even pick their head up. You know what I mean? So, a little swag you ever find out in the middle of nowhere with some brush or, reeds and high grass or weeds in it, let it pick your brain, because you may have found a spot where one of them likes to bed often.
Yeah. And there's a couple of points that you were bringing up there too. Mark, you said you hunt a lot of open flat crop in that north part of Ohio. And that got me thinking about a big buck I was on a month ago. And this buck was literally living in a cut corn, very barren cut corn. It wasn't like a weedy one. And he would just find a little tiny low spot and bed in it. I caught him out there 6 days in a row. And I just didn't have wind on two days that I really needed it to put a stock on him. So I never ended up getting the deer, but it was really cool. And when you find those big bucks like that in those pockets, it's really fun to sit back and kind of observe how they'll play their cards so fine-tunedly with if the wind switches a little bit. I had a situation the year before on a big one. I had 6 stocks in 7 days on him. And, he really liked this one it was open country, but kind of a ditch draw. And that's one thing too in Kansas I find is little tiny ditches. You can't hardly sometimes see them on an aerial, but if it don't need to be very deep, but especially you get a wind time day, you can about bet that there'll be a good one. They like bedding in those kind of like little ditches. We find them in there quite regularly.
Yeah, I see that.
Fact. That's a fact right there. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, out there in the prairie, the wind can blow like a banshee, and they will get down in the little bitty depression or behind a knoll, a small knoll. And I watched some this year, one big buck in particular, come and go from this one spot out in a real broad, low spot. He come and went with 2 or 3 different does over a period of a week that he was breeding. And that's another thing. Those big deer, they might make a trip down to the more traditional cover at night. And, you go down there and you walk that out and you see these giant rubs. And you're like, oh, my God, I'm going to hunt down here. This is where they're at. Well, they're just down there at night. They come down there at night, cut them a doe out of the herd, and take her back out into the wide open to breed her. They do not want no competition with that doe. They don't want to stay down there because some other bucks are going to come by and try to kick their rear ends for her. And, it's natural. You take your girlfriend, take her out in the country to go parking. You know what I'm saying? But anyway, that's the way it works with them. They play the game pretty smart. And if you ever watch one of them coming and going with a doe to a spot out in the open country, you may have found what I kind of think might be, I don't know this. I don't even know when I'm enough of a redneck that I'm repeating stuff that's standard terminology anymore. But years ago, I started calling them breeding sanctuaries. They have spots they like to take their doe to out there, and they will dominate her. I've watched them run them like a cutting horse until both of them's tongues would be flopping out of their head, hitting them upside the head, and they will eventually domineer that doe and make her stay, and she'll give up and stay, and then they breed. And, that usually lasts for like a day and a half. They stay there and do that. And then the next night, he's liable to go down there at 2 a.m, cut him another doe out and head back out there. But if you find one of them out in that open country breeding, you better believe that that's one of his favorite little spots right there.
Yeah, there's a couple good points you brought up there about that. That's a lot of times why I don't like to get hung up on sign that I do find out right. I'm cautious of it, knowing that those deer could you survey the situation. I think you brought up a point earlier. The more you do it, the more you go with your gut. Your gut gets very sharp at being able to detect, is this a public land deer making this sign? Is he coming here in daylight? And I see many times hunters, I think, in my opinion, they'll get hung up on that sign. And it's that's those deer are private land deer that are coming over here at night making that sign. And you might get lucky, but, and that doesn't mean that all sign is that way. But I'm just kind of cautious of that. And one other point, too, in that open country that we look for a lot when it's rut, when we're putting on the miles and we're spending this much time glassing, a lot of times what tips us off on a big mature buck, is an actual satellite buck. Just, if you're covering ground, if you're doing a lot of glass, and we do this in the timber too. I killed one a number of years ago doing this in the timber. I ended up some satellite bucks. I called in and I was like, there's a big buck up on that ridge, I bet, with a doe. And that was all woods, but I use those satellite bucks as they're the ones that let me know, and so we'll look for that. You see a little tiny buck out there, standing in that grass or whatever, and he's doesn't look quite right. Like he's just standing around. And it's like, what's he doing? Well, he's probably satelliting. And you park it there and you start glassing, you might catch a big buck's rack. I mean, pretty good chance there's going to be a big mature buck locked down with a doe, especially out in that open country like that where those doe numbers aren't very high. Usually if a doe is hot, a mature buck's going to find her, and that's you're going to have that.
Now, a lot of you guys are familiar with the old hunting tradition of eating, some organ, the heart or a chunk of liver off the first animal you kill. I had that when I was a little kid, and it was a big deal. Organ meats were always prized by frontier people who knew the importance of getting a lot of different minerals and nutrients. And as often is the case, those guys were onto something, because organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. And you can get the same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil, made exclusively from regeneratively raised, grass-fed, and finished cattle. Heart and Soil's unique freeze-drying process means all those important nutrients are trapped in, ensuring you experience every one of the benefits of nature's superfood in a clean, convenient, taste-free capsule. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And make sure to use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase. That's heartandsoil.co. Use the code MeatEater. There's nothing like snook hook sets at dawn or catching a tarpon in the moonlight. Find your next fishing trip made easy on fishingbooker.com and experience the magic of the Sunshine State or any other destination on your fishing bucket list. Book a blue water adventure in search of sailfish or go snapper fishing with the kids. With over 6,000 captains and trips to choose from, planning your next one just got a whole lot easier. Download the Fishing Booker app on the Google Play or App Store, or visit them online at fishingbooker.com to book your trip today.
You mentioned the satellite bucks kind of tipping you off to locating a buck like that. I know that glassing in general, like getting eyes on a good buck is such a huge part of your whole strategy. Are there any other things you've picked up over the years that help you spot more deer, whether that's where you choose to glass from, or the actual glass you use, or gear you use, or glassing techniques, anything like that helps you actually get your eyes on one?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. One thing is if you're going to do this open ground and you're going to kind of do this spot and stalk kind of thing, I absolutely have to have good glass. Like I can't be without it, because I won't get nearly as much accomplished. So, get some good glass. But one trick that I learned last year, and now I use it all the time, is I have a pretty good tripod, and I've had it for 15 years, but it's got a nice fluid head on it, and it's got a wide enough base that I can just drop my binoculars right on that. And sometimes you get a wind day where you got 20, 30 mile an hour winds and you're trying to glass grass, you got a lot of movement, and it's very hard to pick up just randomly unless you bedded one. If you bed one and he's out there, well, obviously it's easier to find it. But if you're just free floating glassing and you haven't gotten a visual yet, what I like to do is set that tripod up, and then I pull down on it with my binocs, and I can about get rid of most of that wind, that I couldn't otherwise do. And, my buddy Tanner, he was doing some hunting with me this year, and he's a really, really good hunter. And I showed him that trick, and he immediately was like, whoa, this is a game changer. This is a serious game changer. So try that. That's a good one. I always like to have good optics with a good steady rest, and in fact, in the vehicles, I make my own sort of. There's not a window mount that I like, so I'll take an actual fluid head and then I put one of the window clamps on it. So because having a good steady rest when you're glassing stuff half mile, it ain't as big of a deal. But when you're trying to glass, beyond a mile, and sometimes you're getting out there 2-3 miles. I mean, I've picked up deer. I mean, people would probably, think I'm BSing, but I've picked them up right around 5 mile deer before. But you got to have a steady rest and good optics if you're going to do that. You got to have both though.
If you were gonna have to pick just one optic for your long distance glassing, so you're from the car or really long distance type stuff, would you use a spotter or would you like a big, high power set of binoculars for that?
Okay, so if I had to pick one optic and that's the only optic I could use all fall, I would take my 12 by 50s, and those ones are Vortex Ultra HDs. I generally will spot deer with the binoculars first, then transfer over to the spotter to, how big a buck are we dealing with here? Is there other, and try to pick up, if there's, that's one thing. When I get a visual on a big buck and I'm going to make a play, I got to know, is he alone? Does he have just a doe? Is there one satellite buck, 2, 3? Where are they at? Because I got to plan a route to get in there and not just get into compound range. I'm trying to get in longbow range. And so that's a whole nother end, a camera guy, and trying to weasel in there. And, that's the one thing about doing that game is a lot of times we aren't successful, but sometimes it all comes together. And sometimes it's the ones that you think there's not a chance you're going to pull it off, but let's try it, that come together real smooth. That's hunting,
Yeah.
You don't always get them.
Hey, let me interject something right here because I got to tell you, I can't tell you how much I am stymied by the thought of getting in on these big deer and killing them off the ground with a longbow type scenario. You the man, I'm telling you, you deserve, I bow down, no kidding. I know there's a lot of ways to skin a cat, but of all the routes to choose, you make bow hunting, okay? And you do it at the most incredible level. I look for the, shortcuts to kill them, set in a tree stand, let them stumble by. It don't get any better than what you're doing, and I applaud you, okay?
Well, I appreciate that. But, like with it, though, sometimes I've had 10, 15 stalks where I didn't get them. They're unsuccessful. But the cool thing about it is you learn things along the way that sometimes, and you can, I'm sure, attest to that with your style of hunting as well. You learn the ones that you don't get are the ones you always, learn the most from.
Yeah, well, I tell you, to try to figure out what you're doing and make it work, I'd have to start back over. God would have to give me 20 or 30 years back to get started because I'm not a great stalker, and to get into wooden stick bow range and get it pulled off, I couldn't hit them anyway. But listen, I know what you're doing, and I give you all due credit. Okay.
So tell me this, Eddie. With your style of hunting in open country, how important is glassing and optics and all that to you? Do you do any long distance scouting like that beforehand, or is it all ground and pound, hike it until you find a good tree? How does that fit into your style?
Well, I do use optics. I don't use them, at the level that we're talking here. I always have a set of 10 power. I have a little small set of Swarovski 10 powers that go with me, and they're right there in reach because I do, even though I'm not as much into big bucks as I used to be, I still am into them. I want to know what I'm looking at, and I see them a lot of times at a distance that I can't tell if it's a 125 inch or 165 inch, I don't know. So yes, I use them. I really do. But, I'm just to the point in my life now in my early 60s to where if I see a good deer, I want to try to get it that day. I go with, if I don't have a wedgie that day and I'm in a good mood, I want to kill a deer, and I try to do it. I might shoot 140 inch deer anymore, which I used to wouldn't have walked across the street for 140 inch deer, but things have changed. And go with my heart anymore. I didn't even shoot a good deer this year up in Kansas. I didn't even shoot one. I just let them all go and let some 150s go. And finally just, I just, you know what I mean? And so I'm changing. I'm going through menopause right now, and it ain't funny. I'm telling you, guys, live it up while you can. Take this old man's advice. And when you get close to starting to feel it to hit you, shift it into high gear and don't let it get you down. Go get hormone replacement therapy. Do something. Just don't go get old, because it's not going to be fun on you if you've lived large like we try to. I've lived large for 40 years, and it's hard to get old. You know what I mean? It's hard to accept the limitations. So, I just I take really good optics, but I'm sure they don't play nearly as integral part in my hunt as they do Jared's.
Yeah. What's next for you, Andy? I know there's so many things that we're talking about here that make me think about some of the stuff we were doing in Nebraska a few years ago. And even though we were able to get on, I got on one really early and you were on one pretty quick too, we were able to figure it out in that scenario. I'm already thinking, if we'd stayed 10 days or if we were more picky, I wonder if we could have found deer over in this area, or I wonder if we could have went about it a little bit different. In the spot we were hunting, it was slightly different than some of these scenarios in that we were hunting kind of sandhill type habitat with big, wide open, grassy hills, and then very thick covered river bottoms in the middle. So you had one swath of great big cover surrounded by an ocean of open grass. So I'm thinking about that scenario as we're talking through here, but what are you thinking about, Andy?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that too. Here's a good question for you guys. And I know this depends on the time of the year, like early season versus rut versus late. And you guys can expand on that if you want. But in my experience, like I've seen bucks bed in this type of country, like seemingly using the wind to their advantage. But then there's other times I'll see them, like it seems like they're looking more for shade and they're not using the wind to their advantage. And then other times, like maybe in some real cold weather, they're out in the sun more. So it seems like sometimes they're bedded more for a wind advantage, which is what I'm more used to, like back home around Michigan, monitoring, pressure, monitoring their backside and setting up, facing downwind. But I don't always see that in open country. And I often will see deer just kind of moving around to like shady spots if it's like maybe a real sunny day or unseasonably warm. Have you guys seen that same kind of thing? Jared, you probably have a lot of experience with this because you get to observe so many bucks bedded.
Yeah. Here's what I find is when I'm hunting, big bucks, early season, late season, I'll find them using, bedding a lot. They're a lot sharper with how they bed with that wind, at least. And what I'm saying is mature bucks, so 4+, we'll just say, okay. So semi-mature to mature level. Those deer are sharp. They're on another level from those younger two-year-old bucks and even the 3s, to where they get, they don't like it. The wind switches a little bit and they'll get up and rebed 30 yards to accommodate it. They're just on a different level. Now during the rut, there's so many times we sneak up on big bucks that they aren't looking where the general rule of thumb is, okay, they're looking where they can't smell. I find that not to be the case nearly as much during the rut. But also if they're batch or grouped up, that changes too. So you got 2-3 bucks with this, big buck. Usually they're playing it pretty smart. Like this one's got this covered for visual. This one he's got it covered for. It's fun to watch them in these types of situations, and we had a pretty good situation where we were able to document some of that a couple of years ago pretty well, with a big one that I was chasing, but yeah, a lot of times when I'm putting a sneak on them, I'm still just kind of cheating that wind, just off of their nose. That seems to be the route that I'd say gets picked over any other. It's not that often that we can come in straight downwind on a big buck, even during the rut. But I do see where it's not like, hey, he beds down and he's looking where he's not looking where he can smell or can't smell it's not like that's like a rare thing for me to see during the rut. That's pretty common. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. Eddie, have you been able to observe that much?
I'm pretty much right in line with that. Early season, late season's totally different ball game. They're on a survival, pattern, and they don't compromise much there. During the rut, it's more or less a crapshoot, and all them variables he mentioned plays into how it's going to play out. I think it's just a roll of the dice in the rut. And to me, what I'd say is, to me, that's most of the time when somebody's going to be trying to get up on a buck on the ground. It's probably during the rut, I would think. I don't know how much everyone that hunts them on the ground goes out and hunts them in October and in December. I'm sure they do, but their success has got to be mainly in that month of November when the cards turn their way a little bit better and the bucks show their weaknesses. But, I have to play the wind pretty bad. Even out in the prairie, I still am cognizant of it nonstop because I'm trying to stay in an immobile spot. And so I always try to pick the one direction in the one spot to where I think it's the absolute less likely that one of them is going to get around behind me, whether he's crossing country on his own or whether he's running a doe out there. The wind is just, I live and die by it. I don't worry about all the scent stuff. I did for many years. I run myself crazy messing with scent and burn myself out on scent elimination, and finally just said, I'm going back to the old school. And if they smell me, they smell me, but I'm going to try to keep them from it. But, I haven't found it to be much of a, I don't hunt whitetails a whole lot in the first half of October and the last part of December anymore. I don't do it a lot. I hunt them mainly when they're breeding, mid-October through late November. And so it's a crapshoot. It's a crapshoot on what they're doing on any one given day. My advice for that is this: get your eye on the thing, whether on the ground or in the tree, and get that thing over there and get it killed. Use common sense. Do what you got to do. Be a man and get the job done. And if you have to strip off and walk naked backwards to it, then if that's the tactic that works that day, smear mud all over yourself and get the job done. Don't go by all this. We have refined whitetail hunting down to a book. We've got the rules and the regulations. That's a bunch of crap. Everybody wants a book that can tell them how to do it. Well, the book is get your rear end out there and do it and learn and figure it out, and it'll all work out.
Oh, man.
I think what you just said, you two are a perfect example of two completely different strategies, but both get it done. And I think you guys both play into your strengths. Like Eddie, you've said you're so patient. So you're able to put in those days upon days in a single location and waiting for a good buck to make the mistake and come by. And Jared admitted he's a little more impatient and just enjoys chasing them on the ground. And that's his strength. So it's just so cool, to hear two different perspectives. I kind of want to dive into a little bit of the stalk. And I guess this would probably be more to Jared because he does more of this, but
yeah.
There's so many things to keep in mind, obviously. And I'm hoping you could dive into a few things, but from the camo, the lack of camo that you use, I've noticed that you tend to pick out colors that really match that prairie grass. The direction of the sun, which way the animal's facing, even to the best time of the day to do this. So for me, when I'm hunting mule deer, I'm often bedding them down, and I have to keep all that stuff in mind. Obviously the wind direction, which way the wind is, the sun is facing, and all that stuff. And then I like to go after them kind of in that noon to 1 o'clock time frame, because it seems like they're real kind of groggy at that time. They got their head down a lot. They're a little bit sleepy. Do you pay attention to some of those things when you're going in for a whitetail, or is it when you see them, you're going in now?
I used to be rammier to where it was we got to go now. But more often now, as I'm getting older, and sometimes I get burnt on this, but I'll put on that brakes. A few years ago, 2 years ago, we had a good one. It bedded first light. within a couple of minutes of shooting light, he was bedded already. And I was like, you know what? We need some wind to pick up. So that's another good thing about a lot of times we'll just look at weather.com or whatever. And a lot of times, your wind's going to pick up late morning, and that's going to be a better time for you to, have the noise cover that you might need to get in there close. So that's a good factor there. Plus they get settled in and comfortable. So like on this particular deer, I was like, okay, he bedded right at first light, and he's going to get up on his feet and stretch his legs probably within about 2 hours, 9:30, whatever, somewhere in there is for that particular day is what I figured. And I've seen a lot of deer do that. Now, sometimes you'll get lucky and they'll bed right back down there or reposition 10 steps. But I've had situations where if I got a stock and I'm going to have to lose my visual throughout this stock, I've done those before and hadn't waited for them to get settled in comfortable, and they got up and repositioned. And then I had to crawl back out of there and find them back. And maybe they moved 200 yards, 300 yards, 400 yards, find them back. And usually I don't find them back until they get back on their feet, which is, a good chunk into the day. And now I might not have enough time to make a stock. So I think exactly what you said right there. That's usually when I think it's the best time, is right that midday. You wait for the wind to pick up. And that don't always happen. Some days you don't get that wind picking up, but that's pretty common. I like a day that starts out where it's not very windy at all. If it's windy at sun up, deer activity is going to be very, very low. If it's 15, 20 mile an hour plus at sun up, but it'll be a better late morning, mid morning, movement. Not maybe great, but better than first light is what I've found. But one thing I do want to hit on, when I do get a visual on a big buck, because you brought this up about sometimes we're just wearing tan clothes or whatever. It's not even a camo. So we tried ghillie suits a number of years ago. The problem with ghillie suits in the sun, the open country, is unless you're laying flat on the ground, they get really dark on the backside where the sun, can't get to. And then all the bunches of material, if the sun's hitting them on a cross, like crossways, you got these bunches of material and you basically have a valley. So you have a shadow. So they get real dark on the opposite side. So I don't like ghillie suits for that reason. I'm fortunate enough to pick up a lot of our mistakes in video, when I'm editing. But when I get a visual on a big buck and I bet him, most of the time I can pull this off, not every time, but I'm going to plan my route, obviously based off of wind direction being one, and then other factors beyond, after that. But I'm going to try to come straight in. I'm not going to, and I used to do this in the woods too. Like even if I didn't have a visual on a big buck, I'd try to picture where I think they're going to be bedding and approach that bedding area where I'm coming straight at it, because you got so many shadows and highlights in the woods. I know we're talking more open country here, but I do the same thing in the open country. If I'm coming straight at a deer, there's a lot less movement than me coming in at quartering to or even broadside. So I don't, I'm very careful on approaching a deer or a bedding pocket where I think I might be able to visually pick one up. I'm always trying to come in straight on it, because there's a lot less movement for them to pick up. I've realized that I didn't realize I was doing that for a while, and it's just one of them things that I'm like, that's something I always do, and it makes a lot of sense. And so I think it's a good point to bring up to somebody that's maybe never stalked before. Keep that in mind. Plan your route so you're coming straight in on that deer.
So, sorry, Jared, can you, I'm just not tracking. When you say straight on, coming in straight in, so that straight on in relation to the sun, or straight in as in like you are just walking directly at where the deer is? Just explain that a little bit better.
All right. So from the deer's position, a lot of times I'm crawling, but I'm going to crawl straight, so I might have to back out and do a loop to get the wind right, but then I'm going to come straight head on.
I gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I follow you now.
So next time you and Andy are together, and just put him 100 yards out in the woods or in the open country, if he's coming in quartering to or broadside, that's a lot more movement than straight on. Yeah. I know it sounds silly, but a lot of people don't, I think, factor that in. And obviously when you're sneaking, the other thing is I don't like to take my eyes off them when I'm moving, because the second I do that, they're going to pop their head up at some point, and I got to be able to freeze in that moment. And if I'm looking at where I'm going to plant my feet or whatever while I'm moving, then I look up and they got me. So that's one thing. I can look at where I'm going to go, like, okay, I got to move my leg like this, but I don't do that movement until I'm back looking at the deer. So if he picks his head up and looks my direction, I can instantly freeze. And if I didn't do that, I would get pegged a lot more, substantially more. So it's minor little or major detail, but
yeah.
Jared, real quick, do you ideally would you rather come at that deer kind of from the side? Like, so you got a deer, let's say he's bedded on just on the down or on the backside of a little hillside, with the wind coming over the hill and he's kind of facing down. Are you going to try to come in more from the side and slightly above, or it seems like a lot of times you end up like literally like right over top of their back? So what's ideally, what do you try to do?
That's the one thing. Every situation's different. If I can crosswind kill them, that's the way I like to generally do it. And I think the reason I just like to do it that way is because generally I can't come in directly downwind, and the crosswind's the best I got. And you got to really watch that wind though, because I missed out on a big one this year. I had a great wind for a while and I was making a play on him and I was in compound range, but all of a sudden I felt it on the back of my neck. It switched for 20, 30 seconds and he got me. So that happens from time to time, but it was really our only route. We only had an 8-mile-an-hour wind. We had just the right setting to be able to pull this off with this situation. And unfortunately that wind just kind of switched on me. But a lot of times I find that coming in on them crosswind is going to be the best route. In recent years, I've found myself coming over the top a little bit more than I used to. I don't like to do it generally when I'm trying to actually, when I'm moving in on the deer, I don't like to do it as much. It's just hard to film. It's really hard to film that. You're coming over the top skyline. Skyline's already a tough deal, but when I'm like going into a draw, let's say I'm hunting open country and it's kind of got some broken draws and maybe I think there could be a big buck bedded down in this draw or this ditch. I find myself, I realized this last year, over the last 3 years, a lot of times I am coming over skyline. So, which isn't probably the way most guys should start out. But I think I just, over the course of time, I kind of developed a system to how I scan the open country, the draw system or whatever, to where I'm very confident about doing it where I'm going to have them spotted before they get me. But the reason I like doing it that way is because oftentimes I'm in a lot better position to actually spot them. And I think a great example of that is actually the newest video we have out. There's a bonus disc in there, and there was a big buck that I was chasing. And I had 7 stalks in 7 days, 6 were with him. And almost all those, I think actually all those situations, we had to come over the top to move in on him, but also to get the visual. He was a deer that was bedded down at first light a lot of times. He was a smart deer. It wasn't rut yet. And we didn't get busted ever doing that over the top, but that's a fine line there. But I love doing that because usually I got a higher position to get a visual on them. So it's easy for me. And that particular system, sometimes there'd be 3, 4, 5 different bucks in that, maybe a couple does here. And I got to know where all these deer are at. And if I'm coming like on a draw system, if I'm halfway down it, I'm not skylined anymore, but now I might be missing a deer or two that is going to really screw me if I don't have their position. So if you can get good at spotting them first in a skyline type scenario where you're coming over a ridge, that's one thing that I think I realized over the last 3 years I started doing more of. And I don't know how to describe that other than I used to see more tails going the other way. But I think I just I do a really good job scanning the pockets where they might be bedding. And then I'm confident that I've scanned that good enough that I don't go back there and I focus, when I move up a few more inches, now I just focus on this little sliver that I couldn't see before and kind of eliminate that, if that kind of makes sense.
When you're coming over the top, you're really threading the needle on the wind. If they're bedded with the wind to their advantage, right? Oh,
yeah. Some of those situations, yeah. I mean, sometimes I'm coming over skyline and I have the wind working for me, but that's a good point, and that's one thing in the open country when you're talking not the flat ground, flat Kansas prairies that we've hunted and Eddie's hunted a lot, then you go to kind of like that more, it sounds like you guys had a hunt here a couple of years ago where it was probably more like draws, open country kind of stuff. Is that right?
Yeah.
It is fun. One thing that I realized by sitting back in glass, and it's really fun to look at what the wind's going to be like. How much wind are we getting today? And then be able to just set yourself up to be like, okay, all these deer are going to be bedding on this side, these types of draws, these types of ridges. And it gets pretty fun to be able to predict where I'm actually going to take all that knowledge that I learned, and I'm planning to do more wooded stuff like I used to do again, because I can't wait to take what I've learned by watching them in that type of setting and how they use wind and I'll be able to eliminate a lot of acreage on a wooded set. If there's a 15-mile-plus-hour wind in the woods, I'll be able to eliminate a lot of that acreage that I didn't 10 years ago when I hunted woods. I didn't really do that as much.
So just so people can follow along at home, how would you apply that to the wooded setting? So when you're getting that strong 15-mile-an-hour wind, where's that going to push the bedding?
Okay, so if I'm hunting ridge type stuff, like the bluffs of Wisconsin or, a lot of those types of ridge, not all hills are like this, but a lot of that type of hill terrain, those, the bigger bucks are bedded right over the top of that ridge quite often. But, there's different hill systems where that's not true. But that type of setting, now I would just take a look at the top. Okay, we got a 15-mile-per-hour plus wind today. They're not going to be bedded, in these types of settings. They're going to be out of that wind, catching it coming over the top. And I could just go into a wooded scenario and eliminate more of that acreage based off of kind of what you described, Okay, the wind's out of the west, there's a draw, they're catching that scent coming over the top just a little bit, and they're out of the wind. So it's not, it's nice and quiet, where they don't have a bunch of noise going on around them. Deer don't like that. The only deer that I've seen get comfortable with that is those flat plains like Kansas deer. They just got to get used to it. Sometimes they can find a ditch like we were talking about earlier to crawl into. And Eddie, you can probably expand some more on some of that.
Well, I don't know why I spent my whole life stalking, but not whitetails a lot. I spent, mule deer, elk, antelope, whatever. And I don't know what I do compared to the thinking process of everyone else, but like if I'm on the ground after something, I guess I would say the very first thing my mind assesses is the lay of the land, to where my first thought is, how can I get the absolute closest to this animal using the lay of the land before I even have to start thinking about the next step, which might be the wind or the sun angle or the cover, or whether I can, am I going to have, I will try, like if I spot it at 500 yards, if I can get to 200 yards real quick by using the lay of the land, that's step one for me, Now, of course, I'm not going to run into that animal. It goes without saying, I don't even say this. Anybody with a brain knows you don't run in there and let them smell you, you know what I mean? But using the wind, you're going to run in there and get as close as you can using the terrain, and then stop, crawl up there, look at the scenario, and assess how to do it, whether you're going to crawl in on a side hill or come over a skyline right behind them. It'll all depend on where they're bedded and the cover and the wind. The last part is the wind and the cover equation of a stalk to me. The first part is the lay of the land, because unless it's wide open, pool table flat, there's always usually some kind of hill or some kind of a swag you can use to cut your distance in half, But anyway, I don't know if that was exactly what you asked me, but that's what I went on a tangent on.
No, that's good stuff.
That's a great one.
That last moment though, so you use the land to your favor. Jared described a little bit of what he's thinking about as he makes those final approaches. Can you give us a few more thoughts for your final approach once you do have to think about the wind, the sun, crawling versus sneaking? Any other tips from your experience stalking in on mule deer and whatnot?
Yeah, I get as close as I can with the land. Then of course, like I said, I've already got an idea what the wind prevailing is. And I will use the land in conjunction with the wind from the start to get around on some side of that animal that's as close as I can get to where I'm going to have the wind, that where when I start my final stalk, I know I've got the wind at least usable. I don't want to get as close as I can to the animal, and then end up with the wind not favorable to make the final part of the stalk. So you got to put them both in conjunction, but the lay of the land is the first part. When I get close, then I'll stop for quite a bit of time and really watch like he does and look at the surroundings, pick them apart, because, you don't know what's laying there. There might be 3 or 4 of them you haven't seen. There may be some more over there 400 yards away in a bowl across the prairie that, are going to stand up. I don't know how many times I've been stalking a particular animal and it get up and run off because another deer stood up over there 400 yards away and flagged, So, you got to get close as you can to begin with and then assess the situation. And then I'm just a firm advocate of all my stalking. I do pretty much, it's not all, but it's, if I can, I'm going to do it on my knees and elbows. If I'm a stalking hunt type guy, like antelope or whatever, elk, anything, I'm keep as low profile as I can get. I'm going to belly crawl. I mean, the shadow you're throwing is significantly less. And, if you've ever watched a cow walk across the pasture in the early morning or late evening, the thing's throwing an 8-foot shadow maybe that's moving along with it, you know, get as low as you can, get down there where there's no more for them to spot moving than your physical body, and really, really important to me is the part about, he mentioned earlier about keeping your eyes on them. I just absolutely don't move on an animal. Hardly. If I'm in the final stages in the open, I won't move unless I'm watching that thing and knowing that he hasn't tuned into something and that he's not alert and that he's not gawking right my direction at the moment. I watch you don't move if you can't see them good enough to tell what's going on.
Wise words. Oh, man.
I got a question on that. And I know this is going to depend completely on the situation, but which do you guys prefer? So you sneak into a whitetail, mule deer, whatever, and he's bedded. Do you prefer to shoot them bedded down, or is it something where you sneak into bow distance, kind of wait for him to stand up and give you that shot? The reason I ask is because I was forced with this decision in Nebraska this year on a giant muley, and I could have shot him in his bed. I was over him. I came from over the top, like you were describing, Jared, and he was 22, 23 yards or something, but I had a great shot. He was facing directly away from me, but I don't know, just the way the hill was kind of tapered down and what I could see of his body, I just didn't feel super confident with it. So I just kind of sat there and waited, which was risky because, that wind could have swirled at any time, but I just kind of let him do his thing and start, you could tell he was starting to move around a little bit, move his head around. So I knew he was going to stand. And then, after, 40 minutes or so, he stood and then gave me a shot. But what do you guys typically do? I know it's completely situational, but Jared?
I think you made the right call. If something doesn't feel right or you're not confident about that shot, you don't take it. A few years ago, Chansey snuck up on a big buck, bedded in the plains of Kansas in the grass, and that was after Thanksgiving. But he snuck up there. I think he got 6 or 7 yards from it, and it was a big old one. And he shot it bedded. And I think that's the first bedded deer that we ever had on a video that we shot. And, I just wasn't really a big fan of it ever, but he brought up a good, valid point. And he said, you know how many times they stand up and they have us pegged, and now you're dealing with a deer that's just on pins and needles and might get 10 inches of drop on you. There's a lot of variables in there. And I think if you have a good shot on a bedded deer, I don't think there's anything, wrong with that. I don't think I've ever taken that shot, but I'm a lot more open-minded to it than I was, because he had a lot of good points on that. I was like, that's a good point, I thought. So, my favorite shot is a head-on shot, but I'm hunting deer on the ground, not out of a tree stand, and that's a whole different ballgame. And the first time I did it, it was an accident, and I realized how deadly it really is from ground zero. And so my favorite is a head-on shot, then quartering to, then broadside. But a lot of people wouldn't probably agree with that, but about everyone I've ever seen lost is a broadside. So if you're shooting a good setup, that's what I like on that. And so many times on the ground that happens, a head-on or a quarter to. We find that to be pretty common. So I know I kind of got sidetracked there, but
no, that's good. But you said it, and I guess I kind of want to stress that to the listeners. A good setup is key.
Oh yeah,
and a heavy arrow, a good penetrating broadhead, right? So what do you use something pretty darn heavy, don't you?
I do. I actually just got a grain scale the other day. I was like, God, I've needed one of these for a while. I knew I was up there in the 700s, but I weighed it, and I got 808, and then I realized I had a lighted knock on there. So I'm a little bit under 800 on my heaviest setup. And I'm shooting a 2-blade head, which I have my theories on that. It's a cut-on contact, but I look at a 2-blade cut-on contact head like it's really a 1-blade head, because when you got a split bone, you're only splitting it one direction, versus a 3-blade, you actually have to break the bone 3 different directions. Which I'm all about, least to, getting through bone as easy as I can to get you. Breaking bone never kills a deer. So you got to get through it. And, so I'm not afraid. I've shot, a handful on that quarter and two or head on with the longbow, and I've never had a penetration issue. That's what I shoot.
Okay. Eddie, how about you? I know you haven't stalked a lot of whitetails, but even I think hearing some mule deer stories can even be helpful for guys that maybe are going to hunt open country for whitetails. But are you shooting them more bedded, or are you kind of situational?
Well, I've shot a few bedded, a couple over the years, and I can't tell you up front that I ever felt comfortable maybe with that, because it's just a much more compact target that I feel a little less comfortable getting through the thing, because you just never end up, rarely, shooting them in their bed, or you're around on the belly side facing you, the side you can get through the easiest. You're usually trying to shoot through their back or down off of a rise above them or something, and you just have a lot of bone structure. But I've shot them that way and managed to kill them real well. I've had a wound or two over it. I won't hide that. But, the biggest dilemma why I hate stalking is because I can get right up there to them a lot of times and then not get the bow shot accomplished, because, trying to get the bow shot accomplished without them being onto you and running off, or jumping up and spinning around and, facing you, which, I have a mental block. I have a literal mental block about shooting a deer facing me. Back in my early elk hunting career, I tried that a few times. Of course, now it was elk, and it's a different ball game. I didn't get through their front structure well. I have a literal brain dead spot up there that will not function in the heat of the moment. That tells me to shoot them in the base of the throat. I have more of a tendency, like an idiot, to try to shoot them in the chest, and trying to get through that sternum is ridiculous. But I have a problem getting them shot, on their feet. Without them jumping up and running out there and looking back at me broadside at 40 or 50 yards. And then I'm into what I call a hope shot then, and I just end up don't even taking the shot, because I don't feel comfortable with it. I haven't had time to range it when it stopped usually, and I'm not flinging an arrow at it. So that's the biggest problem I've had with my stalking is just getting the thing. I can often stalk up to an animal and feel like I should have killed it. Absolutely should have killed it. And it gets away from me because I'm just too cautious, I guess, with my shots or something. But I haven't done it on the extent, that some of you guys have, maybe to where I've got comfortable with shooting them at some odd angles and stuff. I'm old school. I'm kind of a sissy about, I need them where I know that I have a straight path into their vitals without a massive bone structure in the way. And if I was going to shoot them like that a lot, I would definitely go up to that super heavy arrow and get as much kinetic energy and have it, a good stout built 2-blade cut on tip type broadhead like you described. That's good sense right there.
So we have kept you guys for quite a long time, so I think we got to wrap this one up, even though I know that both Andy and I have a lot more we would love to talk about. But maybe one last question from both of us, if you guys are okay with that.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll drop one here, and then Andy, I'll let you close us out. Right. You both mentioned using decoys in one way or another, but we haven't really gone into the details of it. And you hear a lot about, how effective decoys can be in that open country environment because it's all, it's a sight game in so many different ways in these open environments. So I just would be curious to hear from both of you on exactly how you would use one. I know that, Eddie, you mentioned that you use one less than you used to, that now you don't, but I'd still would like to hear, what the ideal decoy setup would be for you, how far away you put it, what angle you set it up at, when you would use it, etc. And then on the flip side, when I get to you, Jared, I know you started using one maybe like 10 years ago, and you've been using these, self-made decoys that you walk up, behind. And I'm curious how your use of them has evolved, because we talked maybe 5 years ago on the podcast last time about it, and you were talking about, how you were figuring that out and getting aggressive with it, and kind of the crazy, dicey nature of sneaking up on a deer on the ground, holding a decoy out in front of you, and then getting these bucks to want to come in right at you. So when I get to you, what I'm most curious about is how your use has changed over the past couple of years, if at all. But let's start with Eddie. Can you run me through your decoy setup when you do use one and best practices?
Well, you finally pinned me in a corner. I may disappoint you with this one, but I can't help it. I got to tell the truth. Honestly, I don't really feel qualified to really give out advice on decoying because I don't feel like I know enough about it. I would be at infancy stages there, so I probably need advice instead of giving it. Okay. My experience with it out in the open country, it's absolutely, there's times when it has performed miracles, and I have never done it enough to refine down my opinion on what is the best way to do it. I have stuck up a doe decoy before by itself. I like it high. I don't want it bedded. I want them up where, like, if I crack horns at one a quarter mile away, I want them to be able to turn and look and see a deer over there, And I've used small bucks, and I've used the two together. I've had all kinds of reactions, everything from A to Z. I've had does get really seriously irate at doe decoys and spit and hiss and kick and run off. And, and I've had bucks, young bucks, come into them real good. Old bucks come in. I've had bucks that literally seemed repulsed by another buck decoy. They're timid. Some bucks have personality. Some of them are extremely aggressive, even when they're young. I've seen young bucks that went around trying to run everybody in the whole place off, and I've seen old bucks that wouldn't fight for nothing. And anybody that wanted to mess with them, they just turned and got away from them. So I think a lot of it more has to do with the deer and the scenario and the time of the day, the time of the season. As far as me telling you an excellent deer decoy setup and how to use it, I got to deflect on that one. I just don't feel like that's my wheelhouse. You know what I mean?
Hey, that's fair enough. We appreciate that honesty. Sure. What about you, Jared? Do you want to kind of update us on where you stand on the use of decoys while hunting on the ground and what you're doing these days?
Yeah, as far as the decoy, I treat it kind of like we talked earlier. It's a tool. It's not gonna be something I go to every time. In fact, I go to it less now than I used to. What you were talking about there is how we're using a lot of that decoy, in the early years. That was 10 years ago. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, 10 years ago when we kind of developed that one or built that homemade one. I wouldn't manufacture them because there's some dangers involved here with it, but a couple. But anyways, my ideal situation is if I got a big buck, he's locked down with a doe. If I can't sneak in on him and close that distance to make that shot, a great way is to crawl in there with that decoy without him knowing. And then when he's looking the other way, you got to break that perimeter zone though. And that's a very fine line. Like, what I mean by that is there's a certain point where another buck gets close enough to this mature buck and his doe that he's going to run that other buck off. And every deer has its own threshold, just like Eddie was saying. They all have their own attitude and personalities. And some, I could pop that decoy up at 60, 70, 80 yards, and they'll come. They'll leave their doe to come over and cause, run me off. And I'll be right behind that decoy if that's what I'm gonna do there. But other bucks, you might need to get to 30, 40 yards. Well, for a lot of compound shooters, you're in range there. For me, that's kind of pushing it on where I feel comfortable shooting longbow wise. So that's how I like to use it. Now, Chancey's been using it a lot when he calls. So he'll go into places, to do rattle sets. He loves to do that, late pre-rut, late pre-rut, and then post-rut. He loves to do that. And he loves to set that decoy in a spot that's kind of tucked in to where if they come in, they'll catch it, but it's kind of blended in, and he loves doing that because it gives that deer, we're set up on the ground. We're very not concealed, I guess you would call it. And the camera is pretty big that we use. So you got two guys there set up on the ground. So Chancey really likes it. If you're a solo hunter, I think Eddie brought up some great points about how, it's worked magic and it's also drawn a lot of attention in a negative way too. So, but as people can see or have seen in the videos, he does it for calling a lot and has had some pretty good success doing that. But that's kind of where I say you just got to be careful if you're going to set up behind that decoy, like what I'm talking about. You got to be looking for other hunters. You don't want to get shot, and that's kind of a dangerous. So I don't really advocate it too much. And you definitely don't want to use one during gun season, obviously.
Yeah.
You're already hunting public lands, and I've already heard one horror story where it could have been a lot worse, but it was during the bow season, but some young fellas that had been drinking or something and fired a gun, thought it was a big buck, and luckily they missed. It wasn't me, but it was somebody that I ran into in the plains of Kansas that could have been a bad deal. So I always, if I see a vehicle coming up the road and I got the decoy out, and the big buck, if I can do this, I'll pull that decoy down. I don't even want that other guy to know what's going on, or that's just kind of how I am anyway. But and then too, it's a rush when you got a big buck inside of 10 yards coming to charge you. It's a rush, but don't kid yourself. There's nothing safe about that.
Yeah, I'd say so.
So a couple things to think about. I think if we're going to talk about that kind of decoying, it's wise to think about things in those two departments.
Yeah, very, very important. Thank you for bringing that up for sure. Okay, so there's our decoying ideas, whether from a tree stand or on the ground. Andy, how do you want to wrap things up here?
Man, you know what? These guys have they've pretty much answered everything that I had down. I guess I just want to end it with telling them thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. Two guys that I really admire, look up to, and I thought it was really cool to hear the two different perspectives from two guys that are beyond successful, consistently successful in this type of country. So just thanks again, guys, for coming on.
Yeah, thank you guys for having us. I think
absolutely. Thank you much. I'm glad to be in the brotherhood.
It's a great group. Well, right back at you guys. I'll second what Andy said. This has been a lot of fun. I know we all learned something, and everyone listening for sure too. And the biggest thing is that now I am just chomping at the bit ridiculously to schedule my own open country hunts this year and definitely make sure I'm back out there because, man, just thinking about these scenarios and thinking about that swaying grass and the big blue skies overhead and looking off in the distance and seeing tines coming through the grass, I don't know, it gets like the hair standing up on my arms and I'm just ready to do it. So thank you guys for inspiring that feeling in me right now.
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
That's what it's all about.
It is. All right, let's wrap this one up. And that's a wrap. I enjoyed this a lot. I hope you did too. If you want more from these guys, I would suggest going and picking up a copy of Peterson's Bowhunting Magazine, where you can read some articles from Eddie, or head on over and follow Whitetail Adrenaline on their Facebook page, or check out their website where you can pick up Jared's most recent DVDs. They're a lot of fun. You get to see some of the things he just talked about, and it's just as crazy as it sounds. So go out, support those guys, and try adding some of this stuff to your repertoire. Trying new things is one of my absolute favorite parts of deer hunting. I constantly want to learn more. I constantly want to grow and evolve. And I think that there are ample opportunities for us to take some ideas here in our open country discussion and do just that. So thank you again for your attention. Thanks for your time. And until next time, stay wired to hunt.
I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase. Hey everybody, listen up. I got mega huge news. MeatEater Live is heading back out on the road. That's right. Join me and the crew. Clay Newcomb, Cal, Yanni, Spencer's going to be there. Phil the engineer's going to be there. MeatEater Live, headed back out. Now, when you get every ticket, okay, every ticket you buy, you get a signed copy of our new MeatEater Outdoor Cookbook. This tour is celebrating the release of the book. Buy a ticket, get a signed copy, MeatEater Outdoor Cookbook, wild game recipes for the grill, smoker, camp stove, and campfire, which I'll point out is a $38 value. Here's where we're going to go. April 23rd, the Mesa Arts Center in Mesa, Arizona. April 24, the Balboa Theater in San Diego. April 25, the Grove in Anaheim, California. April 27, the Crest Theater in Sacramento. April 29, the Union in Salt Lake City. April 30, the Egyptian in Boise. May 1, the Wilma Theater in Missoula. May 2, the Bing Crosby Theater in Spokane, Washington. May 4, Revolution Hall in Portland, Oregon. And May 5, the last day of the tour, Pantages Theater in Tacoma, Washington. For tickets and more information, visit the events page at themeateater.com. Hope to see you at the show.